Hello and welcome to Phosphorus Live. This is our bi-weekly look at the very interesting world of xIoT, the extended Internet of Things. I'm your host, Mike Huckabee. I'm the VP of Technical Go-to-Market here at Phosphorus, and I'm joined by our device-obsessed senior sales engineer, James McCarthy. Topic for today is the trouble with firmware. As I like to say, it's like a cybersecurity spider web, everything all connected in different places. So we as security professionals, we as people who are trying to run businesses, we buy a lot of these types of devices. And of course, most look different, but that doesn't mean the insides are different. My uncle has a big kind of industrial woodworking shop. And so I was there and I was visiting and I started to look around, as you do when you're a bit device obsessed, and I saw cameras. The cameras were Lorix cameras. I'm not sure that I know that manufacturer. And so I said, I wonder who makes them. Who makes those? And are they an OEM? Are they manufactured somebody else? Are they a white label? Or are they made expressly by Lorix? I actually found out that Lorix was spun out from Dahua, which is a company that actually is prohibited in the US from selling into the US. Now, I know this all becomes problematic because, well, all of the plastic may look different on the outside, but what's in the inside at the metal side of it really can be very, very much the same and reused wherever you go. And for our environment and people trying to secure xIoT environments, this is a major concern that we all need to think about. So there's an article, it was a few years ago, it was describing that there were a number of manufacturers that were using a common firmware toolkit, build firmware for devices. And inside this toolkit, as one to do, there's a lot of tools to be used. And part of that was the tools to how to create SSH access to your devices. And they supplied certificates, as you will. Well, so many manufacturers actually implemented that code straight with the actual SSH keys, the SSH certs that were in the toolkit. So now that caused an incredible problem. You had all of these diverse manufacturers who actually had the same SSH keys. So if you could compromise one, you could basically compromise all of them. So it makes it very, very clear. The trust devices have to know more than just what the plastic looks like. So we also find in that same kind of idea that we find default credentials get propagated kind of in the same way. We had really interesting thing happen to us on our side. As I said, we're device obsessed. So we take devices, we bring them into our lab and we learn how to talk to them. Well, at one point, we were looking at a new medical device that we brought in from some manufacturer. And we were trying to determine the default credentials on that so that we could log into it. We couldn't find, it wasn't published anywhere. We couldn't see where those default credentials to access the firmware were. However, as we were tearing things apart, we noticed that there was a file that actually indicated a company name. And what was interesting to us is we thought we saw that exact company name on a different medical device from a different manufacturer. So we went to that, verified that, yes, that same file with that same company name was there. We said, oh, well, I wonder if the credential that we can use on this other device works on the one we're trying to figure out. So we did just that. We took the credential off the old device. We used that credential to log in successfully into the new device. And it was like just a watershed moment at that point for us about third parties that are being used to create different capabilities within devices that we're building or we're using all the time, and that some of those components are being completely reused. So I read another article that that I'll bring up here. It was an article on IoT firmware deployment and integration from Intuos. And it pulled out 4 different issues that I thought were interesting with having to deal with IoT and firmware management. And the first one they roll out is a lack of reliable IoT standards that you can adhere to, or being able to make sure for you as a person who is actually buying those devices, if you can trust how it's being manufactured and what's being used underneath. And there's a massive use of third-party components, and those third-party components are not necessarily, vetted or well controlled by the manufacturer of the device. I gave you 2 examples of where that firmware reuse and the third-party reuse can be problematic if you're not looking at it. If you buy a device from a major manufacturer, they may tell you right away if there is a vulnerability that needs to be patched. However, as quite often happens, if those manufacturers are OEMing or creating white labels of their firmware or the underlying metal, those other manufacturers that might be utilizing that, if they're not finding the CVEs, they may not be actually divulging that. They may not even know that it's there. So again, incredibly problematic. If you look at NIST, NIST has a platform for resilience guidelines is one way to be able to look at it. So just imagine for you, as you're bringing in devices that are critical to your business, you can start asking the manufacturers, are you following the guidelines that NIST is putting out there about how your firmware should be built to a way to make sure that it minimizes the ability to be attacked? So that's a key thing for you to be able to do. And the other advice that I would have is just to do your research, ask the questions. And a lot of times you can use tools like Phosphorus to be able to give you insights, 100% deterministic insights into what you have, so that you can understand if you might be having a device in there that might be having firmware reuse, hardware reuse, and that the credentials and other things might be the same, or firmware might be being reused as well. Just gives you a little bit of insight in that. So now, just to kind of demonstrate that a little bit, I want to hand it over to James to give you a little bit of insight on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got just a couple things to walk through. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. I think the topic here is I think really pretty fascinating for me, especially because just this idea that you can buy one thing, but be getting something else entirely, right? And just something that's kind of hidden behind a layer of obfuscation, and now you're exposing yourself to risk that you didn't really know was there, in a lot of ways. So I think it's a pretty interesting topic. The idea here is just to kind of demonstrate how common it really is in the IoT space when you talk about manufacturers just simply, rebranding or rebadging other, manufacturers' actual hardware. And so we see it quite often. And because of our unique ability to actually talk to these devices and touch the metal, we can detect that, right? And we can help you navigate that. So this is just an example here. There's 3 different brands of cameras, including the Lorex that you mentioned, Mike, that your uncle has in his shop. But you can see it's literally just this. It's the same underlying web server. It's the same application that's running and serving up those credentials, including the same default manufacturer's credentials. But they just change out the logo. That's it. They're just rebranding the logo. It's just a simple white label process, and something that we've been doing in the IT side of the house for years. But IoT is no different. And then just a quick look here at the actual cameras themselves, right? So physically, well, again, there is some, you can see the plastic itself is a little different, slightly different shape, but you can tell that the underlying physical hardware, the metal behind the plastic shield is all the same, right? And so ultimately, it's really just 6 ways to buy the same thing, and it's a pretty common problem. And this is, I think, just highlights a little bit. You look at Hikvision here on the left, the bigger one. That's just a cross sampling of some of the many different vendors that rebrand Hikvision's hardware out to the world, and kind of how how easy it would be to purchase one of those brands, not realizing that you're ultimately really buying something that might be for your business or your organization banned for purchase here in the US, or even just a risk that you didn't know was present in your environment. So that said, I want to actually show a couple things in the product real quick, because I think there's some interesting things to show. At a really high level, when you look at managing devices through Phosphorus, because our platform is built on this concept of connecting to and logging into devices, it gives us that ability, which we've talked about here today, to actually talk to the device, touch the metal, and log into it. And more importantly, it lets us navigate the firmware. And so that's a big part of our process. When we go out and find new hardware and build support for a new device family, we're doing it to the firmware specifications. And as part of that journey, we're actually taking that firmware apart, mapping it out, understanding where all the nooks and crannies are, where's that data sitting in that firmware. And what's great is, as we do that, especially for those kind of underlying OEMs that then rebadge as other companies, that mapping, that kind of structure of the firmware stays consistent through all those different vendors. So when we go out and see and show in your device table here a bunch of cameras, or let's go type, device type is, help if I click correctly, device type, and we can just do like an IP camera here and search. If I just hit enter, we're going to pull up all of our different IP cameras. If we look at some of these behind the scenes, like a Huawei or a Vigilon or whatever these are, even Hikvision, that's us reporting on what's actually underneath the covers. That's us saying that while this device may be masquerading as something else entirely in your environment, this is what we know it to be under the hood, right? This is what's actually running on the device and the risk that's associated with that. And so we actually have two examples in our lab here of devices that we, as part of our support for customers, when we see something new that we've never seen before, we go out and we try to acquire it, right? We try to grab it, put it in our lab, and then we build support for it. And so for us, one of those devices that we came across for a customer was called a value cam, right? So you can imagine where the purchasing decision, kind of what that decision matrix was. Hey, this is an IP camera. It seems to be enterprise grade, but it seems really cheap. So let's just buy a bunch of those and stick it in our environment, right? Save some cash. Well, what we found is that while it may have been sold as a value cam, and the badging and the branding was all value cam this, value cam that, when we connected and logged into the device, it was actually a DAWA camera under the hood, right? And so we can actually see here that we're able to pull all of the actual data from this device in tag it accordingly, right? So this was like, hey, we know this is a value cam on the outside, but under the hood it's a DAWA. And then we're able to, when we give enrichments and when we provide security context to our customers and say, hey, this device has risk associated with X, Y, and Z, we're doing that per what's under the hood, not what we perceive it to be on the outside. So when we report on vulnerabilities, when we report on default credentials, it's actually accurate. It's not kind of, we don't get tricked up by that OEM mismatch that can happen. And then the same thing here. We see this fairly commonly with Mercury Security. They're a great brand. They sell tons of hardware all around the world for a lot of door controllers and a lot of other kind of building management system devices. But they've got a chip that is fairly commonly OEM'd by third-party vendors, where they actually take this and put it into. We see the same chips in door controllers as we do in badge readers and other things as well. And what's interesting is it's always Mercury Security. Even though the vendor that sold the hardware to the customer was something completely different, we still see it as that Mercury Security. And one thing to note here too that I think is really important when you're talking about how to detect this, and why I think our approach to doing discovery and doing remediation is so powerful, is because the one thing that happens often in IoT is they're not just rebranding the firmware. They're not just taking this firmware, repackaging it, and selling it again. Manufacturers also take MAC addresses, and they buy these MAC addresses in large groups or large blocks from other vendors, and then they don't change the name or the information, or they might actually change it. But in either case, you now have a MAC address mismatch or a reuse of something that might show up as something completely unrelated to the thing that you have, because they didn't want to have to go out and create all of their own MAC addresses or buy those things net new. So they're literally buying them from companies that are going out of business, or they're buying them wholesale from companies that are no longer using these large blocks of MAC addresses. And so what happens is, if you're relying on that kind of traditional passive approach to find these kinds of issues where you've got this kind of secret underlying hardware, if you're just relying on that Mac OUI lookup, then you're gonna get some confused data, right? You're gonna get some low fidelity data. All right. So that said, that's the end of my CAN presentation.
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
Great. So that's it for our quick session today. We are going to stop recording